Picture this: you're trudging through an endless, watery graveyard of mud. Each agonizing step is a desperate battle against the relentless suction of the earth itself. You haven't known sleep in 96 hours, for there is no solid ground, no respite from the mire. If your forward momentum falters, you begin to sink. If you stumble and fall, the treacherous mud threatens to swallow you whole. All around you, men are drowning while still upright, their bodies too utterly exhausted to even lift their heads above the murky water. And at the very head of this grim procession, this march of the damned, rides a lone figure atop the last surviving war elephant. His hands clutch the reins with a feverish intensity, his right eye swollen shut, weeping with infection, and throbbing with a pain so acute it would surely incapacitate any ordinary soldier. Yet he does not stop. He does not cry out. He simply continues to push forward, relentlessly. This is the brutal reality of 217 BC, and the man willfully destroying his own body in his unyielding quest to destroy Rome is none other than Hannibal Barca. Before we plunge deeper into this relentless saga of survival and burning revenge, if you're eager to uncover more of history's hidden, visceral truths, please hit that like button and subscribe. And do let me know in the comments below where in the world you're tuning in from. It's truly remarkable to witness how our shared curiosity for the past connects us across continents. The crossing of the Arno marshes was far more than a mere march. It was a slow-motion disaster unfolding day by day. Most history books tend to glide over this harrowing episode. They recount the treacherous Alps, but the Alps, for all their dangers, were primarily about the cold. These marshes, however, were an insidious, lethal trap. For 4 days and 3 nights, Hannibal's army never once touched dry ground. There was no opportunity to set up camp, no chance to cook a meal. They simply walked, interminably. The conditions were truly gruesome. Soldiers at the front of the column ceaselessly churned the already saturated earth into a deep, viscous slurry. By the time the rearguard finally reached these areas, they were literally wading through liquid filth. When sheer exhaustion finally overcame the men, they couldn't lie down on the ground to rest. Instead, they clambered onto the bloated, floating carcasses of dead pack animals, desperate to keep their heads out of the water for even a few precious minutes of sleep. They used the dead as macabre, temporary rafts. This was the extreme level of desperation Hannibal not only demanded but exemplified, and he paid the ultimate personal price. Elevated somewhat above the worst of the mud on his war elephant, Surus, Hannibal could not escape the pervasive infection. The insidious swamp bacteria infiltrated his right eye, and the resulting inflammation was catastrophic. He had no medical assistance, no clean bandages, and absolutely no time to halt. He made a chilling choice: he simply let the eye die. He sacrificed half his vision, a part of himself, to ensure his army kept moving forward. Why? Why drive an army through a route so deadly it claimed more lives than the enemy ever could? Because in Hannibal's calculus, speed was the deadliest weapon of all. The Roman consul Flaminius confidently awaited Hannibal on the main road, guarding the easy, obvious path, absolutely certain that no army could possibly survive a crossing of those impassable marshes. He was profoundly mistaken. Hannibal didn't merely flank the Romans, he materialized behind them like a malevolent ghost. When his mud-caked, half-blind army finally staggered onto dry land in Etruria, they had achieved what was widely considered impossible. They had completely bypassed every single fortification Rome had so carefully constructed. The shock was not merely tactical, it was a profound psychological blow. Hannibal had proven, unequivocally, that he would endure any agony, cross any hellish landscape, just to seize Rome by the throat. But a man capable of allowing his own eye to rot out of his skull for the sake of strategic advantage is not forged overnight. That extraordinary degree of discipline, that singular obsession, is painstakingly manufactured. To truly comprehend the monstrous force that emerged from the swamp, we must journey beyond the mud of Italy and travel back 20 years in time. We need to go to a sacred temple in Carthage, where a father is poised to hand his 9-year-old son a knife and present him with a choice that would, in time, set the world ablaze. To understand the man who could lose an eye without so much as flinching, we must first understand the brilliant architect who built him. Hannibal was not born a monster, he was meticulously engineered. His creator was his father, Hannibal Barca, a man whose very name, Barca, literally means lightning. And indeed, like a bolt of lightning, Hamilcar was brilliant, terrifying, and utterly destructive. Let us transport ourselves to Carthage in 241 BC. The First Punic War has just concluded. To the average Carthaginian citizen, it was a bitter defeat, but to Hamilcar, it was nothing short of a profound betrayal. He had fought the Romans fiercely in Sicily for years, consistently remaining undefeated on the battlefield. He was a tactical genius, effortlessly outmaneuvering the clumsy Roman legions. Yet, even as he consistently secured victories on the front lines, the short-sighted politicians back home capitulated. They signed a humiliating peace treaty that systematically stripped Carthage of both its hard-won wealth and its cherished pride. Rome didn't merely win, they ruthlessly bullied Carthage, seizing the vital islands of Sicily and Sardinia and demanding crippling war reparations that would cripple the Carthaginian economy. Hamilcar returned home not as a defeated general, but as a man consumed by a cold, calculating, and unyielding rage. He came to the chilling realization that Rome was not a power with whom one could negotiate. Rome was an existential threat, a relentless predator that would, eventually, devour Carthage whole unless it was utterly destroyed first. But Hamilcar knew he was growing old, too old to finish this monumental war himself. He desperately needed a legacy. He needed a weapon, perfectly honed, that would outlive him and continue his fight. Enter Hannibal. The truly defining moment of Hannibal's life unfolded when he was just 9 years old. It is one of the most famous and frequently recounted scenes in the history of the Roman Republic, yet we often overlook its immense psychological weight. Hamilcar was making preparations to depart for Spain, or Iberia, as it was known in those days, his mission to rebuild the fractured Carthaginian Empire and secure the crucial silver mines needed to pay Rome's exorbitant extortion fees. The young Hannibal, full of youthful fervor, pleaded with his father to let him accompany the expedition. He had no desire to linger in the soft luxuries of the capital. He yearned for the rugged, adventurous camp life. Hamilcar agreed, but on one profound condition. He led the boy into the hallowed precincts of the Temple of Baal-Hamon. Imagine the oppressive atmosphere, heavy incense smoke coiling through the air, the flickering, dancing light of sacrificial fires casting eerie shadows, and the profound, echoing silence of the attending priests. In the ancient world, oaths were not merely empty words, they were solemn, binding contracts with the divine. To break such an oath was to invite cosmic destruction upon oneself. Hamilcar made his 9-year-old son place his small hand upon a sacrificial victim, a freshly killed animal still warm with blood, and swear a solemn, unbreakable vow. The exact phrasing may vary slightly across the ancient texts, but the absolute sentiment was unmistakable. I swear that so soon as age will permit, I will use fire and steel to arrest the destiny of Rome. This was far more than a simple promise. It was a psychological anchor, deeply embedded within the boy's soul. From that singular moment onward, Hannibal's life was imbued with a singular, unyielding purpose. He was not raised as a prince destined for a royal court. He was rigorously molded into a soldier. Hamilcar took him to Spain, deliberately removing him from the corrupting influences and political intrigues of the Carthaginian Senate. For the next decade, Hannibal's sole classroom was the battlefield itself. This formative period is absolutely crucial to understanding the fundamental dynamic between Carthage and Rome. While Roman aristocrats were immersed in studying rhetoric and law within the bustling forum, Hannibal was learning the unforgiving realities of sleeping on hard ground, enduring gnawing hunger, and the stark necessity of how to kill efficiently. He ate the exact same coarse food as the common soldiers, he dressed indistinguishably from them, and he fought shoulder to shoulder by their side. Hamilcar was imparting a vital, foundational lesson: loyalty is not purchased with shimmering gold, it is forged and earned through shared suffering and hardship. This unique upbringing created an extraordinary psychological profile. Hannibal was a high-born noble, yet he possessed the rugged, practical instincts of a common grunt. He could engage in profound philosophical discussions with Greek tutors one moment, and in the next, brutally sever a limb in the heat of combat. He learned to read the intricate terrain of the land like a detailed map and to discern the true intentions of men like open books. Most importantly, he meticulously observed his father fighting. He absorbed every nuance of Hamilcar's tactics, his masterful use of ambushes, his unwavering reliance on lightning speed, the very lightning style of warfare that defined the Barca name. But Hamilcar, ultimately, ran out of time. In 228 BC, during a skirmish with local tribesmen, Hamilcar found himself cornered. In a desperate act of self-sacrifice to save his sons, he deliberately drew the enemy away, only to drown in a river. Hannibal, then a hardened 18-year-old, watched his father die. The architect was gone, but the weapon he had painstakingly crafted was now fully finished. The ingrained hatred for Rome had been tempered and sharpened by years of harsh discipline and the raw agony of grief. When Hannibal eventually assumed command of the army at the age of 26, he was no mere general. He was the living manifestation of his father's vengeful ghost. He inherited arguably the finest army in the world, a truly multicultural force comprising Libyans, Numidians, and Iberians, all fanatically loyal not to the distant city of Carthage, but to the formidable Barca family itself. And he had a plan. He would not idly wait for Rome to initiate the Second Punic War. He would personally bring the war to them, to their very doorstep. He was going to accomplish the utterly unthinkable. He cast his gaze northward, toward those colossal mountains that no army had ever dared to cross in force. The Alps were calling. In late 218 BC, Hannibal embarked upon an endeavor that virtually every military expert of the age declared impossible. He surveyed the imposing Alps, that massive, frozen mountain range serving as Italy's formidable natural fortress, and resolutely decided to walk his entire army over them. To truly grasp the sheer insanity of this decision, one must understand that in the ancient mind, the Alps were not simply mountains. They represented the very edge of the known world, a mythical realm where gods resided and where mortals met their doom. The logistical challenges alone were a nightmare beyond comprehension. Hannibal was not simply a solitary hiker with a backpack, he was effectively moving an entire city. His force comprised roughly 50,000 infantrymen, 9,000 cavalry, and a staggering 37 war elephants. Imagine the immense caloric requirements. A single elephant, for instance, consumes approximately 300 pounds of food daily. In those barren, snow-covered peaks, there was no grass, no forage whatsoever. Every single scrap of food had to be meticulously carried. This was not a military march, it was a desperate, agonizing race against starvation. And the mountains were far from empty. They were inhabited by fiercely hostile Gallic tribes who viewed this massive, slow-moving army as nothing more than a tantalizing target. As the Carthaginian column stretched for miles along precarious, narrow, and icy ledges, the tribesmen launched ambushes from the heights. They rolled massive boulders down the cliffs, crushing men and horses alike, sending them screaming into the bottomless abyss below. It was a massacre unfolding in excruciating slow motion. Hannibal was forced to wage a vertical war, dispatching his light infantry to scramble up the sheer cliffs and seize the high ground, just to halt the devastating rain of rocks. But the most relentless and insidious enemy was the biting cold. As they ascended higher into the formidable peaks, the relentless autumn snows began to fall with increasing intensity. The already faint path vanished entirely beneath fresh drifts. Men who had spent their entire lives under the scorching sun of Africa and Spain were now freezing to death inside their heavy armor. Animals, struggling for purchase, slipped on the treacherous ice, dragging their helpless handlers with them over the edge into oblivion. The psychological toll on the army was immeasurable. Every single step was a perilous gamble with death. Then, they encountered a seemingly insurmountable roadblock. A massive landslide had completely swept away the path on a sheer cliffside. On one side yawned a terrifying drop of 1,000 feet, while on the other, an unyielding rock wall rose vertically. The army was utterly trapped. They couldn't turn back, as the hostile tribes were pressing them from behind. And they couldn't advance. They were stranded on a freezing, exposed ledge, with their precious supplies rapidly dwindling. This was the moment where Hannibal's genius transcended from mere tactical brilliance to innovative engineering. He did not panic. Instead, he employed a shrewd understanding of rudimentary science. He commanded his men to chop down the few stunted trees clinging to the desolate area and pile the wood around the colossal boulders that blocked their way. They then set the wood ablaze, waiting patiently until the rocks glowed an incandescent red-hot. Then, in a stroke of primitive chemical engineering, Hannibal ordered his men to pour their meager rations of sour wine, essentially vinegar, onto the superheated stone. The sudden, violent thermal shock of the cold liquid striking the intensely hot rock caused the stone to shatter and crumble into manageable fragments. It worked. The desperate soldiers, fueled by starvation and the grim will to survive, used pickaxes to clear the debris, painstakingly carving a new, narrow path into the cliffside. They worked in shifts, relentlessly, until the precarious passage was wide enough for even the massive elephants to pass. The descent into Italy was, with cruel irony, even deadlier than the brutal ascent. The southern slopes were significantly steeper and cloaked in treacherous, slippery ice, often cunningly hidden beneath fresh layers of snow. Men would step onto what appeared to be solid ground, only to slide uncontrollably to their agonizing deaths below. But finally, after 15 harrowing days of pure hell, the remnants of the army stumbled out of the mountains and into the fertile valley. The human cost was absolutely staggering. Hannibal had entered the Alps with nearly 60,000 men. He emerged with barely 26,000. He had lost almost half of his formidable army, and many of his war elephants, to the unforgiving cold and the treacherous cliffs. He arrived in Italy gaunt, utterly exhausted, and vastly outnumbered by the formidable Roman legions already waiting for him. But he had achieved the one thing Rome had never dared to expect: he was there. The Roman Senate was thrown into utter panic. They had complacently assumed the Alps served as an impenetrable, God-given shield. Now, the monster they so feared was not merely at their borders, but deep within their backyard. The crossing of the Alps was not just a strategic movement of troops, it was a profound statement. It declared to Rome that no barrier, whether natural or man-made, could possibly keep Hannibal Barca out. The invasion had truly begun. By the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal was entrenched deep inside Italy. He had miraculously survived the treacherous Alps and the deadly marshes, but mere survival was never his ultimate goal. He needed a victory so utterly devastating that it would shatter Rome's unyielding confidence to its very core. To achieve this, he didn't seek out a conventional battlefield, he sought out a victim. His chosen target was Gaius Flaminius, a Roman consul who was undeniably brave, fiercely patriotic, but crucially, fatally arrogant. Hannibal, with his shrewd understanding of human nature, knew Flaminius was not the type to sit idly and wait. He was a politician, desperate for a quick, decisive victory to appease the fickle voters back in Rome. So, Hannibal initiated a cunning campaign of psychological torture. He marched his army brazenly past Flaminius's camp, burning villages and laying waste to crops, yet deliberately refusing to engage in direct combat. He was, in essence, contemptuously slapping Flaminius in the face, overtly daring him to emerge and fight. Flaminius, his pride wounded and temper inflamed, impulsively took the bait. Enraged, he ordered his legions to pursue Hannibal, marching at a furious pace, recklessly abandoning proper reconnaissance. He was chasing a phantom, and that phantom was expertly leading him directly into a catastrophic meat grinder. The strategic location Hannibal meticulously chose was Lake Trasimene. Geographically, it was nothing less than a natural death trap. A narrow road snaked along the northern shore of the lake, tightly squeezed between the water on one side and steep, densely forested hills on the other. On the morning of June 21st, a thick, heavy fog rolled in ominously off the lake. It blanketed the entire valley floor, reducing visibility to almost zero. Hannibal had skillfully concealed his entire army, cavalry, infantry, and slingers, within the hills directly above the road, perfectly hidden by the dense tree-line and the obscuring fog. Below, the unsuspecting Roman army marched in a long, dangerously disorganized column. They could not see the enemy lurking above them. They couldn't even discern the end of their own sprawling line. They mistakenly believed Hannibal was days ahead, supposedly fleeing in terror. Then, with a prearranged signal, the hills suddenly erupted with life. Thousands of Carthaginian soldiers charged ferociously down the slopes, crashing with devastating force into the unsuspecting flank of the Roman column. Because of the dense fog, the Romans were utterly unaware they were under attack until the enemy's spears were already piercing their chests. It wasn't a battle, it was a brutal execution. The Romans were caught in an inescapable trap. If they turned left, they collided with the impenetrable Carthaginian shield wall. If they turned right, they were mercilessly pushed into the deep, churning waters of the lake. Thousands of men, weighed down by their heavy armor, were driven into the suffocating mud and drowned without mercy. The lake water turned so crimson with blood that, to this very day, a small stream in the area bears the name Sanguinidum, the place of blood. But here is the single detail that truly captures the unfathomable intensity of this massacre, a detail so rare and utterly shocking that it sounds like it belongs in a work of fiction. While this horrific slaughter was unfolding, a massive earthquake violently struck the entire region. It was powerful enough to topple statues in nearby cities, divert the course of entire rivers, and trigger devastating landslides in the very mountains where the battle raged. Yet, the esteemed Roman historian Livy meticulously records that not a single soldier on the battlefield noticed it. They were so utterly consumed by the primal adrenaline of survival, so completely locked in the frenzied grip of killing and dying, that the earth literally shook and split beneath their feet, and nobody felt a thing. That, truly, is the chilling definition of total war. In less than 3 brutal hours, an estimated 15,000 Romans were brutally killed. Another 10,000 were taken captive. Flaminius himself suffered a gruesome end, decapitated by a Gallic horseman, his head grotesquely mounted on a spear. The Roman army stationed in the north had, to all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. When the shattering news finally reached Rome, the Senate, for once, didn't attempt to spin or sugarcoat the truth. A magistrate emerged to face the weeping, despairing crowd in the forum and simply declared, with stark honesty, "We have been defeated in a great battle." Panic, raw and unbridled, swept through the city. The bridges spanning the Tiber River were immediately destroyed. Women knelt in fervent prayer in the temples, fully expecting Hannibal to march through their gates at any moment. But Hannibal did not march on Rome, not yet. He shrewdly understood that he could not capture a fortified city of that immense size without proper siege equipment. Instead, he turned his army south. He was meticulously preparing for his ultimate masterpiece. Trasimene had been a profound tragedy for Rome, but what was coming next would be nothing short of an apocalypse. He was strategically heading toward a dusty, sun-baked plain known as Cannae. The date was August 2nd, 216 BC, on the vast Apulian plain near the town of Cannae. The sun blazed fiercely overhead, and a hot, dry wind known locally as the Vulturnus whipped grit and dust directly into the faces of the Roman army. Rome had finally had enough of Hannibal's clever tricks. They were done with ambushes in the fog and the horrors of the swamps. They resolved to solve the Hannibal problem with an overwhelming display of brute force. They assembled the largest army in their entire history, 8 legions supplemented by their numerous allies, amounting to nearly 86,000 men. It was a colossal sledgehammer, designed with a singular purpose: to utterly smash Hannibal's army flat. Leading this formidable host was Consul Terentius Varro, a man whose philosophy held that subtlety was a mere trait for cowards. Hannibal, dramatically outnumbered by almost 2 to 1, then did something that, to any conventional military observer, appeared to be suicidal. He arrayed his infantry in a peculiar convex crescent, deliberately bulging outward toward the oncoming Romans. Crucially, however, he positioned his weakest soldiers, the Gauls and Iberians, in the very center of that outward bulge. His elite African heavy infantry, by contrast, were placed on the far wings, cunningly hidden behind the curve of the formation. It was, in essence, a trap constructed entirely of human flesh. When the massive Roman battle block crashed with immense force into the center of the Carthaginian line, the impact was earth-shaking. The Gauls in the center, though weaker, held their ground bravely for a moment, then began a controlled, disciplined retreat. They did not break and flee, they slowly, deliberately walked backward, fighting fiercely for every inch of ground. The Romans, misinterpreting this controlled withdrawal as a sign of imminent victory, surged forward with triumphant shouts. They pushed deeper and deeper, convinced they were shattering Hannibal's line. But they weren't breaking it, they were unwittingly entering it. As the center of Hannibal's formation continued its calculated retreat, the line inverted. The initial convex shape slowly transformed into a deadly concave sac. The Romans were now funneling themselves, with terrifying precision, into a meticulously designed kill box. Suddenly, Hannibal gave the decisive order. The elite African infantry on the wings swung inward like massive, closing doors, striking the vulnerable Roman flanks with overwhelming force. At that precise moment, the Carthaginian cavalry, having already routed and chased the Roman horsemen from the field, returned with thunderous speed and slammed into the Roman rear. The trap was sprung shut. The perfect double envelopment was now terrifyingly complete. But this is precisely where the standard history books typically draw their line, and where the true horror of Cannae truly begins. We must delve into the grim physics of this unprecedented slaughter. This was the horrifying compression effect. Imagine, if you can, 80,000 men crammed into an ever-shrinking space. As the Carthaginian ring inexorably tightened, the Romans were pressed together so densely, so impossibly tightly, that they literally could not lift their arms to swing their swords. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, chest to back, unable to move. The dust churned up by the desperate struggle became blinding, thick in the air. The heat was suffocating, overwhelming. Panic, primal and absolute, seized the trapped masses. The men in the very center could not even see their enemy. They could only hear the agonizing screams of their comrades dying on the tightening edges of the circle. They were crushed, literally, by the sheer, suffocating weight of their own army. Historical accounts describe soldiers, in their utter despair, digging shallow holes in the ground and burying their heads in the dirt, seeking to suffocate themselves and escape the unimaginable terror. Others were later found with their hamstrings deliberately cut. Hannibal's men would slash the legs of the outer Romans to disable them, then move on to kill the next standing man, returning later to finish off the crippled ones. This was no longer a battle in any conventional sense. It was industrial-scale butchery. For agonizing hours, the Carthaginians mercilessly hacked away at the trapped, compressed mass of Roman humanity. It is estimated that at the very height of the slaughter, approximately 600 Roman soldiers were dying every single minute. That chilling statistic translates to 10 human beings extinguished every second. By sunset, an unnatural silence descended upon the field. Over 50,000 Romans lay dead. Among them were 80 senators and the consul Paulus himself. Rome had lost a staggering 20% of its entire adult male population in a single, brutal afternoon. The blood was so deep and pervasive that the Carthaginian victors had to literally scrape the gore from their arms just to grasp their loot. Hannibal had achieved the impossible. He had utterly annihilated a vastly superior force through an unparalleled mastery of tactical geometry. The Battle of Cannae is, to this day, still meticulously studied in every military academy on Earth as the perfect battle. But for the men trapped inside that terrifying circle, it was quite simply the day the world ended. The sun set slowly over the field of Cannae, leaving behind a silence far heavier and more profound than the deafening clamor of battle. In the Carthaginian camp, the celebration was wild, unbridled. They had achieved the impossible. They had not merely defeated, they had effectively erased the Roman army from existence. The road to Rome now seemed wide open, beckoning. That night, inside Hannibal's command tent, his cavalry commander, Hannibal, slammed his fist onto the table. He was ecstatic, the adrenaline of victory still coursing furiously through his veins. He looked directly at Hannibal and made a bold, direct proposal. "Send me ahead with the cavalry," he declared, "and in 5 days you shall dine in the capital of Rome." It was, by all conventional military logic, the most obvious and opportune move. Rome was virtually defenseless. Its legions lay dead. Its gates were open. But Hannibal sat there, his gaze fixed intently on the map, and slowly shook his head. He refused. He argued that he needed time to rest his exhausted men, to gather crucial siege equipment, to meticulously plan his next move. Hannibal stared at his commander in a mixture of disbelief and exasperation, then uttered one of the most famous and biting lines in all of military history. Vincere sis, Hannibal, victoria uti nisus. Or, in English, you know how to gain a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one. Was it a catastrophic mistake? Historians have hotly debated this pivotal decision for over 2,000 years. If Hannibal had marched immediately, could he have ended the nascent Roman Republic then and there? Perhaps. But Hannibal was a professional soldier, a master strategist, not a reckless gambler. He knew that Rome was a city fortified by massive walls and defended by hundreds of thousands of determined citizens who would fight him street by street, block by block. He possessed no catapults, no battering rams. He was betting, fundamentally, that Rome would behave like any other rational ancient nation. In the ancient world, when you suffered such a complete annihilation of your army, the established rule was simple: you sued for peace. So, instead of marching directly on Rome, Hannibal dispatched his brother, Mago, back to Carthage to deliver the astonishing good news. Mago strode into the Carthaginian Senate, a body that had long been deeply skeptical of Hannibal's distant war, and he did not launch into a grand speech. Instead, with a dramatic flourish, he simply upturned a massive basket onto the marble floor. Thousands upon thousands of gold rings spilled out, clattering loudly across the polished stone. In Rome, only the equestrians, the upper class, the knights, and the esteemed senators were permitted to wear gold rings. Mago calmly explained that each ring represented a noble Roman leader, a high-ranking official, personally killed by Hannibal's forces. The pile was so vast, so undeniably immense, that it actually had to be measured by the peck. It was undeniable, visceral proof that Rome's entire leadership had been utterly decapitated. But while Carthage erupted in joyous cheers, Rome underwent a terrifying transformation. When the first few survivors from Cannae stumbled back into the city, unadulterated panic threatened to tear the very fabric of Roman society apart. The desperate cry, "Hannibal ad portas! Hannibal is at the gates!" echoed ominously through the labyrinthine streets. But then, something truly chilling occurred. The Roman Senate convened, not to discuss terms of surrender, but to outlaw grief itself. They passed an extraordinary decree forbidding women from openly crying in public. They severely limited the official mourning period to a mere 30 days. Most astonishingly, they outright banned the very word, peace. This was not merely stoicism, it was a profound psychotic break. They were so utterly traumatized that they consciously decided to reject reality itself. In their desperate, raw need to appease the wrathful gods, these supposedly civilized Romans descended into an act of barbarism. In the Forum Boarium, they buried 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks alive, a horrific ritual human sacrifice intended to wash away the terrible omens and restore divine favor. It vividly demonstrated the absolute depth of their terror. They were willing to do literally anything to survive. And then came the unprecedented mobilization. Rome scraped the absolute bottom of the barrel for manpower. They lowered the recruitment age to include boys who had not even reached puberty. They emptied the prisons and armed the criminals within. Most shockingly of all, they purchased 8,000 slaves from their owners, armed them, and promised them their freedom if they fought valiantly. They called these new recruits the Valones. Hannibal, still operating under the conventional rules of ancient warfare, sent an envoy to Rome to discuss the ransom for the thousands of prisoners he had captured at Cannae. It was standard practice. You pay me, I give you your men back. The Roman Senate, however, refused to even meet the envoy. They coldly declared that any Roman soldier who had surrendered was not worth saving. They callously left their own sons and brothers to rot in Hannibal's camps rather than give him a single coin of gold. This was the pivotal moment Hannibal realized he might have made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had indeed broken Rome's army, but he had failed to break its indomitable will, its very mind. In fact, he had achieved the inverse. By striking them so incredibly hard, he had inadvertently stripped away their humanity, transforming the Roman state into a cornered, rabid animal that would fight with savage ferocity until its last drop of blood. The war of tactics, as Hannibal understood it, was over. The brutal war of attrition had now truly begun. For the subsequent 13 agonizing years, a strange, suffocating stalemate descended upon Italy. Hannibal was, technically, the undisputed winner. He marched up and down the length of the Italian boot, remaining utterly undefeated, sacking cities, and capturing towns, yet he was effectively fighting a ghost. After the unparalleled catastrophe at Cannae, Rome had finally, painfully learned its lesson. They realized that engaging Hannibal in an open field was an automatic death sentence. So, they entrusted the reins of the war to a brilliant but unpopular man named Quintus Fabius Maximus. His enduring nickname was Cunctator, meaning the delayer. At the time, the Romans despised him. They branded him a coward and openly mocked him for his steadfast refusal to draw his sword in a direct confrontation. But Fabius was the only man perceptive enough to truly understand the nature of the Second Punic War. He astutely recognized that Hannibal's ultimate weakness was not his tactics, but his tenuous supply line. Fabius ingeniously introduced what we now famously call the Fabian strategy. It was a war of shadows, a relentless game of cat and mouse. Wherever Hannibal's army moved, Fabius followed, always keeping his legions on the high ground, always just tantalizingly out of reach. If Hannibal moved into a valley to forage for desperately needed food, Fabius was there, on the overlooking hill, watching. If Hannibal attempted to bait him into a direct fight, Fabius steadfastly remained put. More brutally still, Fabius implemented a scorched earth policy on his own country. He systematically burned Roman crops, destroyed Roman farmhouses, and evacuated Roman villages before Hannibal's arrival, deliberately starving his own people to ensure Hannibal's army had nothing at all to eat. It was a cruel, deeply unpopular, and ultimately absolutely brilliant strategy. Hannibal was now a prisoner within Italy itself. He was like a magnificent lion trapped in a cage. He could still roar with ferocity, he could pace restlessly, but he could not escape. His army, too, was slowly but inexorably changing. The hardened veterans who had miraculously crossed the Alps were gradually dying off from old age, disease, or minor skirmishes. They were replaced by local Italian mercenaries who did not share the same fanatical loyalty or the rigid discipline of the original Carthaginian force. The sharp, deadly edge of the Carthaginian sword was visibly dulling. Yet, even in this slow-motion suffocation, Hannibal's extraordinary genius would still flash like lightning. There is a famous story from the Ager Falernus region that serves as undeniable proof he remained a master of the mind game. Fabius had, for once, managed to successfully trap Hannibal in a valley, effectively blocking all the surrounding mountain passes. It appeared to be an absolute checkmate. But that night, the Roman sentries positioned on the ridges witnessed something terrifying. Thousands of torches began moving mysteriously up the mountainside in the impenetrable darkness. It looked precisely as if the entire Carthaginian army was launching a desperate, daring night attack over the peaks. Fabius, ever cautious and methodical, immediately moved his own troops to intercept the lights. It was a masterful trick. Hannibal had gathered 2,000 oxen, tied bundles of dry wood to their horns, set them ablaze, and then stampeded them frantically up the mountain. While the Romans were preoccupied chasing what they believed to be a burning Carthaginian army, Hannibal quietly marched his real army out through the now unguarded pass below. He had, once again, outsmarted them with brilliant deception. But these isolated moments of pure brilliance were becoming increasingly rare. The overarching strategic reality for Hannibal was grim and steadily worsening. He received almost no meaningful help from Carthage. The envious politicians back home, resentful of his immense success, steadfastly refused to send significant reinforcements. He was, to all intents and purposes, utterly on his own. And while Hannibal was frustratingly stuck playing this costly game of cat and mouse in Italy, Rome was executing decisive moves elsewhere. They finally realized they couldn't directly kill the lion in its cage, so they decided to attack the lion's den itself. They dispatched powerful armies to both Spain and Africa, And steadily rising through the ranks of the Roman army was a young man who had actually survived the catastrophe at Cannae. He had studied Hannibal not with fear, but with an almost obsessive fascination. He meticulously noted every single move, every clever trick, every innovative formation. He was the only Roman who didn't wish to avoid Hannibal. He ardently desired to emulate Hannibal. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he was about to irrevocably change the entire game forever. While Hannibal was preoccupied staring at burning cows in Italy, the true war was being decisively won or lost in Spain. The man Rome chose to send there was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was remarkably young, only 25 years old, legally too young to command an army, but he was the only man courageous enough and willing to take on the daunting task. Why? Because both his father and his uncle had been brutally killed by Hannibal's armies. Scipio was fundamentally different from previous Roman generals. He did not fight like a traditional Roman, he fought, strikingly, like Hannibal himself. He understood that warfare was not about rigidly following established rules, it was about ingeniously exploiting them. In 209 BC, Scipio set his sights on New Carthage, the vital capital of the Carthaginian Empire in Spain. It was a formidable fortress, surrounded by water on three sides and considered virtually impregnable. But Scipio had diligently done his homework. He learned from local fishermen that the lagoon on the northern side drastically drained at low tide. Just as Hannibal had masterfully utilized the Alps and the marshes to his advantage, Scipio brilliantly used the ocean. He patiently waited for the tide to recede, and in a move that seemed like divine intervention to his awestruck soldiers, he marched them directly through the shallow water where the walls were dangerously low and entirely unguarded. They stormed the city with breathtaking speed and efficiency. In a single afternoon, Scipio captured Carthage's entire treasury, its most skilled artisans, and its valuable hostages. He didn't just win a battle, he, in effect, stole Hannibal's wallet. With Spain now irrevocably lost, Hannibal's strategic situation in Italy became critically precarious. He was rapidly running out of men, and his last, desperate hope lay with his brother, Hannibal Barca. Hasdrubal, in a remarkable feat of his own, managed to raise a new army in Spain and then successfully crossed the Alps, retracing Hannibal's old, perilous path. He was bringing much-needed fresh elephants, fresh gold, and 30,000 additional soldiers to finally join his brother in Italy. If they managed to link up, Rome was, without a doubt, doomed. But Rome, having learned its bitter lessons, had now internalized the critical value of speed. The Roman consul Nero, not the emperor, cunningly intercepted Hasdrubal's messengers. He learned the entirety of Hasdrubal's plan. In a daring, forced march, Nero took 7,000 elite troops, marched north in absolute secrecy, and swiftly joined forces with the northern Roman army. They then dramatically outnumbered Hasdrubal at the ensuing Battle of the Metaurus, and utterly annihilated him. Hannibal knew nothing of this catastrophic turn of events. He was patiently waiting in the south, scanning the horizon with increasing anxiety for his brother's banners. One morning, the Roman cavalry rode up to Hannibal's outpost. They did not attack. They simply threw a sack over the ramparts and rode away, leaving a chilling message. When Hannibal's guards hesitantly opened the sack, they discovered the severed head of Hannibal Barca. The Romans hadn't merely killed him, they had meticulously preserved the head so Hannibal would undeniably recognize it. It was a message of pure, unadulterated psychological brutality. Hannibal looked at the grisly face of his brother and reportedly uttered, with profound resignation, "I see there the fate of Carthage." He knew, in that gut-wrenching moment, that it was truly over. The desperately needed reinforcements were dead. The vital supply lines were irrevocably cut. Scipio had successfully conquered Spain and was now making meticulous preparations to invade Africa itself. The Roman Senate finally, decisively recalled Scipio to plan the invasion of Carthage. Hannibal, the legendary man who had terrified Italy for an agonizing 15 years, received the order he had dreaded most profoundly. Come home. He was forced to abandon the aging veterans who had fought so fiercely and loyally for him, to kill his own beloved horses because he couldn't transport them, and to sail back to defend a city that had so often failed to support him. The stage was now meticulously set for the final, epic duel. Two unparalleled masters of war, one an aging, battle-scarred legend, the other a rising, brilliant prodigy, were about to meet on the desolate sands of Zama. October 19, 202 BC, on the plains of Zama, just south of Carthage. The air hung thick with swirling dust and the pungent, unmistakable smell of impending violence. After 16 grueling years of relentless bloodshed, the fate of the Second Punic War had finally come down to a single afternoon's confrontation. But before the swords were even drawn, something truly extraordinary transpired, a moment so cinematically perfect it feels as though it were penned by a masterful screenwriter, yet it is meticulously recorded in the ancient history books. Hannibal and Scipio rode out, unaccompanied, to meet each other in the empty, tense space between their massed armies, attended only by their interpreters. Imagine the almost unbearable tension hanging in the air. On one side stood Hannibal, now nearly 50, a living legend, one-eyed, his face deeply weathered by years of war, the very man who had haunted Rome's darkest nightmares for a decade and a half. On the other stood Scipio, a vibrant 33, strikingly handsome, supremely confident, and as yet undefeated, truly, the Roman Hannibal. Hannibal spoke first. He offered peace, appealing to Scipio's sense of caution. He sagely warned Scipio about the unpredictable fickleness of fortune, reminding him that a triumphant victory today could so easily transform into a devastating disaster tomorrow. His voice, perhaps, carried a note of profound weariness. Scipio listened respectfully, his gaze unwavering, meeting Hannibal's lone eye, and then he firmly refused. He simply stated, "You started this war, Hannibal. Now you must finish it." They then rode back to their respective lines. There was truly nothing left to say. Hannibal played his final, desperate card, an unprecedented force of 80 war elephants. This was the largest elephant corps he had ever managed to assemble. His plan was brutally simple and direct: charge the massive beasts straight into the Roman center, crush their tightly packed formation, and then allow his infantry to systematically mop up the shattered survivors. But Scipio, with his meticulous preparation, had been anticipating precisely this move. He had personally witnessed the devastating power of elephants firsthand, and he had devised an ingenious solution based on principles of physics, not mere brute force. He meticulously organized his legions not in the traditional checkerboard pattern, but in deep columns with wide, open lanes running straight through the entire army. He then cunningly disguised these lanes with light skirmishers, ensuring that the Carthaginian elephant drivers could not perceive them. When Hannibal gave the signal, the very ground shook with the thunderous charge of 80 elephants. As they approached, the Roman skirmishers blew thousands of trumpets simultaneously. The cacophony was absolutely deafening, disorienting. Some of the elephants immediately panicked, turning back in terror and horrifically, trampling Hannibal's own cavalry on the wings. The remaining elephants that continued their charge crashed into the Roman line, but instead of hitting an impenetrable wall of shields, they found nothing but empty space. The disciplined Roman soldiers simply stepped aside, forming a corridor. The elephants, following their natural path of least resistance, ran harmlessly down the wide lanes Scipio had so brilliantly created. As the colossal beasts rumbled past, Roman soldiers mercilessly hurled spears into their soft, vulnerable flanks. The unstoppable force had been utterly nullified by empty space. With the formidable elephants now gone, rendered useless, and his cavalry decisively routed, Hannibal was forced into a grinding infantry slugfest. His hardened veterans from the long Italian campaign fought with the fierce desperation of men who knew there was absolutely no possibility of retreat. For a brief, desperate moment, they were actually pushing the Romans back. It looked as though Hannibal might, against all odds, pull off one last, impossible miracle. But then, the terrifying ghost of Cannae returned. The Roman cavalry, having thoroughly chased the Carthaginian horsemen off the field, brilliantly wheeled around and returned at full speed. They smashed with devastating force into the rear of Hannibal's embattled army. It was a grim, poetic justice. Scipio had turned Hannibal's own signature move, the perfect encirclement, directly against him. The master had been decisively defeated by his very own lesson. A staggering 20,000 Carthaginians lay dead. Hannibal, witnessing the complete and utter collapse of his army, fled the field to urge the Carthaginian Senate to surrender immediately. He delivered the stark, unvarnished truth. "I have not just lost a battle, I have lost the war." Carthage, with no other choice, surrendered. The terms of surrender were utterly humiliating. Carthage was forced to burn its entire fleet, 500 ships in the harbor, creating a colossal bonfire that could be seen for miles around. They had to pay a massive indemnity, an astronomical sum that would cripple their economy for decades. And most devastatingly, they were strictly forbidden from waging war without Rome's express permission. Carthage ceased to be a formidable superpower and was reduced to a mere client state. The terrifying nightmare was finally over. Rome had unequivocally won. But for Hannibal, the official end of the war was not, in fact, the end of his extraordinary story. Survival, as it chillingly turned out, would prove to be a punishment far worse than death. One might naturally assume that the story concludes definitively at Zama. The supposed bad guy loses, the triumphant hero wins, and the credits satisfyingly roll. But history, in its complex reality, is rarely so clean-cut. Hannibal did not perish at Zama. He returned to Carthage and, in an even more astonishing turn of events, took a desk job. He was elected as a suffet, the chief magistrate of Carthage. And just as he had demonstrated his unparalleled genius on the battlefield, he proved to be an equally brilliant administrator. He systematically rooted out rampant corruption, reformed the archaic tax system, and so rapidly rebuilt Carthage's shattered economy that, within just a few years, they actually offered to pay off their entire war debt to Rome in a single, lump sum payment. This utterly terrified Rome. They acutely realized that Hannibal Barca didn't require war elephants to remain dangerous. As long as he drew breath, he remained an existential threat to Rome. Consequently, the Roman hardliners vehemently demanded his arrest and extradition. Hannibal, ever vigilant, knew they were coming for him. He fled into the night, thus beginning a tragic, wandering exile that would stretch for nearly 20 years. He traveled from one kingdom to another across the Hellenistic East, to Syria, Crete, Armenia, and Bithynia, relentlessly offering his services as a military advisor to anyone who harbored a desire to fight Rome. He became a spectral figure, a bogeyman, haunting the very edges of the known map. He was the old lion, now toothless and declawed, but still roaring defiantly, still desperately attempting to ignite one last, furious conflagration to bring down the formidable Roman Republic. But the world, as it inevitably does, had moved on. The various kings he served, while perhaps awed by his legendary name, generally didn't truly listen to his advice. They used his formidable reputation for prestige, but largely ignored his strategic counsel. Finally, in 183 BC, the net inexorably closed around him. Hannibal was living in Bithynia, in what is modern-day Turkey. The Romans, exerting immense diplomatic pressure, compelled the local king to surrender him. Soldiers surrounded his house. Hannibal, ever the meticulous planner, calmly checked his secret escape exits. They were all blocked. He did not panic. He had carried his ultimate escape plan with him for years, prepared for this very eventuality. He wore a ring with a hidden compartment containing a lethal dose of poison. He gazed at the poison, and then spoke his final, poignant words, recorded by history with a biting sense of irony. "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." He then drank the poison and died. He was 64 years old. So, ultimately, who truly won this epic conflict? On the literal map, Rome won, undeniably. They mercilessly razed Carthage to the ground in 146 BC, famously salting the earth so thoroughly that nothing would ever grow there again. They became the undisputed masters of the entire Mediterranean world. But in the deeper, more profound realm of the mind, Hannibal won. He fundamentally, irrevocably changed the very DNA of Rome. Before Hannibal, Rome was primarily a regional power, relying largely on a citizen militia. To defeat him, Rome was forced to transform itself into an unstoppable military machine. They had to normalize the idea of a standing, professional army, of powerful generals wielding absolute authority, much like Scipio, Sulla, and eventually, Julius Caesar. The persistent, pervasive fear of another Hannibal was what, in effect, created the vast Roman Empire. It molded them into a ruthless, paranoid, and relentlessly expansionist power. They conquered the world not primarily because they intrinsically wanted to, but because they were perpetually terrified that if they ever stopped, another monster, another Hannibal, would inevitably come storming over the Alps to challenge them. Hannibal Barca did not, in the end, destroy Rome. Instead, he forced Rome to destroy its own republic in order to survive his onslaught. He shattered their very psyche, and in doing so, he forever shaped the course of Western history. If you've enjoyed this deep, immersive dive into the mind of antiquity's greatest tactician, please be sure to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments below, do you believe Hannibal was a valiant hero fighting for his beloved home, or a ruthless villain who tragically sacrificed his people for a deeply personal vendetta? Until next time, remember, history isn't just a collection of dates and maps. It is, profoundly, the story of us.